Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with the refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka Uber Bear. Let's crack them open and get to the episode. All right, so I have named this episode with a very clickbaity type of term here, right? So my little disclaimer before we begin, I'm calling it the fear of five. And what I want to say is my disclaimer in the beginning is if you are a individual who has a strong disdain towards five color good stuff, this is not to sell you or pull you to the dark side of five color good stuff.
Maybe it is.
So we're actually going to kick it off with we're going to have a little hook here. We're going to say that this particular card in my Powered Vintage Cube, we're going to start out with that conversation, was kind of the card that sprung the leak in the dam for the idea, right? It was present and accounted for, yet I wasn't fully supporting it. That card was Golos, the Tireless Pilgrim. 5 colors, get a legendary artifact creature scout. When Golos, the Tireless Pilgrim enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card, put that card onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. Or you can pay 2 colorless and Wooburg, exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn without paying their mana cost for a 3/5. Or as Stu likes to refer to in my 2-headed giant cube, spin that wheel.
Spin the wheel, baby.
Spin that wheel.
Spin it to win.
You and Chill, whenever you play the 2-headed giant cube, this was the chase card for both of you.
It was. I was encouraging him, like, don't finish this game. I want to spin to win with Golos as many times as possible. Banding Commander, rip. Bit unfortunate for all the Commander players out there looking for definitely, like, the best good stuff. 5-color Commander out there, but just a good, like, 5-color for 5 colorless mana for a 3/5 with a very, very strong ETB, and that 2 colorless and Wooburg effect. I love my, like, slot machine kind of effects as well, right? So I'm a big Grenzo Dungeon Warden fan, you know, flip the card off the bottom of your library. If it's a creature, put it in, those kind of shenanigans. But what are we really focused on today?
Well, we're going to talk about the colors, or the 5 colors that kind of...
The whole 5
it
colors.
generates this kind of concern, this, like, innate disdain that players have, and how 5 colors may or may not threaten the actual, I guess, the construction or the infrastructure of their cube environments, and whether or not they want to breach into that idea or the lack of, because they want to, I guess, die on that hill, right? And I'm one of those people that died in that hill. There was a lot of questions that came up between you and I as whether or not too much mana, and what would people do if they were provided that much mana? How might that impact the actual gameplay, the archetypes, how games actually resolved, right? Would it take away from the fun?
No. That's all I'm going to say. No. And the reason is very simple. Fixing, this is something that we've kind of hashed out in previous episodes, right? We've had discussions about, you know, why you should or should not in this cube run this kind of fixing, or why you don't want to run triomes, or yada, yada, yada. But for me, there's a simple reality, is that players like to cast their spells, right? And they like to be able to cast them on the turn that they figured they kind of should, you know, 2-drop on 2, 3-drop on 3, yada, yada, you know, acceleration aside. And fixing allows players to cast the spells that they draft in the deck that they want to draft. I don't really think you need to go much further than that from, like, the very, very sort of root level. You can go all the way through why you don't want, you know, such and such good stuff to be as powerful or as viable as archetypes that you've put into your cube. But that, to me, is the strong argument for why do I want that to be something that's a part of my cube, because it is going to be somewhat defining in your cube, right? If your fixing isn't very good, or there isn't very much of it, that is going to be a huge impact in how the deck is drafted, or how a cube is drafted, right? If that fixing is there, then players will know, I have that ability to be able to draft those 3 or 5, or even 5, or 3 or 4, or even 5, as in the case of something like Golos. So to me, I think it kind of seems like a little bit of a no-brainer for the most part. I think that restricting your players because you want them to draft very, very specific archetypes that you yourself have designed and implemented as a cube curator, I understand that, but if you were to ask me, do I like being restricted in that way, which you haven't, but I'll answer it anyway, then the answer is probably going to be no. I would prefer for the fixing to be there and then for me to make the decisions on how I draft afterwards.
So I kind of want to do a little bit of a case study, and it's going to be directed towards our good friend Stu here. And we used Golos as kind of the starting point of this conversation. But when I first put Golos in this cube, at the time, all we had was the Ikoria Triomes. And I, at the time, ran 5 of the suite. And I ran the Shocks, and I ran the Pains, and the AB Duels, and all that, right? So
and
there
the
was
fetches.
And the fetches. So there was opportunity for Golos to go grab them all. And Stu was imploring that I add the new Capenna, the completed set, and don't ask me to say the names of all those cards, but whatever you call those, we'll call them more Triomes at this point, right?
Fetchable Tri-lands. I mean, how good is that?
But it was interesting, like that nudge, that push, and adding them. But one thing that I immediately observed is Stu drafts my Power Cube on the regular. Like, he is probably the most predominant drafter on Cube Cobra that I see, along with others. And one thing that I definitely noticed, and this has a lot to do with the intensity or the volume of mana that's in that environment, combined with the efficiency of cards like, we'll say, Preordain or maybe Flame Slash or all these cards, I have definitely 100% noticed the predominance of 5-color and 4-color good stuff emerging post adding the Triomes, whereas before I didn't actually have that observation.
All right. So let me address that first of all. Okay. I'm not drafting 3+ color decks because they are value decks, right? I will say that whenever I draft a vintage cube, and I would say that especially with your list, like I've drafted it both online and on paper enough now that I'm pretty comfortable and knowledgeable about the list, so that when those signpost cards come out, when those engines and those big payoffs, right, the high value cards come up, I'm gonna take them pretty highly, and I'm gonna take the lands that I need to support that fairly highly as well, right? I'm maybe not going to take, a fetch land over an entomb as an example, but I'm still going to take those lands fairly highly. And the 3-color decks typically, I will say, are 2-color with a splash, right? It's very rare that I draft a very, very wide, like 33, 33, 33, 3-color deck, right? Occasionally I might like to try and pull something like that off, but typically I'm looking at 2 colors with a splash for the most part. I think I could draft those decks without the Triomes. I don't need that fixing in order to be able to draft those 2 colors with a splash. It certainly helps, but it's not a requirement. What does become a requirement is when you've got such a breadth of the card colors that expand throughout the archetypes that you don't know, just because you're playing a red deck, you're not. If you're playing a red deck, that you're just going to get every red card, or that no one else is playing red. In fact, if you're playing a lot of red strategies, let's say you're playing a red deck wins, right? You're playing a burn deck, right? A mono red aggro deck. Someone else might want the sneak attack or the through the breach, right? They need their red fixing. Someone else might be playing Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze, and they need their red fixing. Someone else might be playing a Lands Matters deck, and they need Ren and 6, and then they need red fixing. So now all of a sudden you've got multiple different archetypes that can all exist, not even within the same cube, but within the same draft, where all of those players need their red fixing.
So right? It's contested, essentially.
Fixing is always going to be highly contested, right? Fetch is first. I think you can make the argument the original duels and the Shocklands and even the Triumphs coming in tapped is definitely a consideration. You don't want too many of them. But the fact that they exist gives all the players that have the opportunity to pick cards that are going to work within the archetype that they're drafting, because there's so many that shares colors. And you can probably do this for a bunch of others, right? You could be playing a blue control deck, or you could be playing, again, an Underworld Breach deck, or you could be playing, some other flavor of blue, green, black, whatever the case may be. There's all this spread now, right? It's not, and I don't want to say that it's always been this way, that the white players drafted white and the red players drafted red, but and maybe there's, I don't know, I don't have the historical data necessarily to back this up, but I've noticed that, like, I've wanted to splash more. And it's not necessarily always just for value. Sometimes it's because that is a legitimate card that is going to be really good in my deck, that's just in this random third color that normally I wouldn't unless I had this 1 or 2 cards. but now I want to draft it.
In the Wayback Machine, we had the ability to put notes in there. The person who drafted it could say what their intent was of the deck. And now I'm having to piecemeal Stu's smattering of the color pie to try to make a deterministic idea as whether or not he was trying to be 5-color good stuff oriented, or whether or not there was a actual like intent of the deck. Most of the time, the signpost kind of solved that for me. But it is interesting to see that now with the addition of triomes. I feel like I have enough data points, that I can actually look at your drafts and other people's drafts and say that once I added those versus in the way back when I didn't have those, I'm definitely seeing a lot more loose decks where they're not just like, we'll say gut decks, even though it didn't exist during the time, that's doing like a sacrifice within the Rakdos lane. I'm now seeing it as gut equals good stuff value in a deck that may go outside of that normal expectation. That's just an observation.
Yeah, I don't disagree. But gut also isn't a card I love gut. I think it's a super powerful card. I'm not just putting it in every red deck, right? If I'm looking for more of a control combo deck, if I'm looking at, putting together a breach deck or a sneak attack deck or a brain freeze deck, whatever the case may be, I'm not necessarily putting Inti or Gut or any one of these like utilitarian kind of aggressive creatures with a little bit of whatever on the side, right? Sometimes, yes, you will, but not always will you. So, but I still go back to that, the importance of, because there's so much, what's the word we used, Anthony? We made a whole episode on it very recently.
Diversity?
Close. Parasitic.
Parasitic. Okay. Yeah, that's a wonderful word.
Is what I was looking for. Parasitic. But yeah, like this is, and look, the vintage cube, I think, is such a different animal when it comes to the scope of all of the cubes that you have, right? You've got your thematic cubes. You've got your even high power sort of focused type cubes, right? Like the artifact cube, I think, is a great example of that. But I think the vintage cube almost needs to sit in its own little bubble when it comes to the fixing, because there's so many cards. Like black, you can always find a room for, some kind of tutor, right? Or at least I can. I know not everyone would share that sentiment, that they don't always need or want tutors in every deck. I'm always happy to draft a demonic tutor.
I want to put a pin in what you just said, and this is a defense of the hearth for those players, specifically on the thematic builds that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
I would say that there's more grace provided for the vintage power cubes or the high-powered legacy cubes or those traditional cubes like MTGO role players, right? Where 5-color good stuff is kind of not the exception, but the rule more times than often. At least it should be prevalent. When we start deep diving, or at least...
But they're a weaker deck.
They are a weaker deck.
They're weaker than your focused reanimate deck or your focused Storm deck.
I would agree with that. Like, there's diminishing returns on the idea.
There's a lot of diminishing returns. Plus, if you really want that really good fixing, and now we're talking about the triomes, which again, I'm a big fan of, now you're facing the fact that they are coming into play tapped. It slows you down.
Yeah, so consistency is sacrificed for... speed, right?
Yeah.
So my question that I have for you is very poignant, and this is kind of going back to the defense of the hearth of the idea of, and there's a reason we're distilling down to an idea here. This is all coming from a conversation that happened at an LGS, which we're building up to that. There's a crescendo, I promise.
It is.
But my direct question for you is, does the land saturation that we see in modern Magic, does it diminish the role of green as a role player for ramp and moving you forward in the game, overarching? Does it harm green as a role player?
No, because green's ramping ability is strong, right? Don't get me wrong. It's nice to have those little elves out, but the land saturation, I don't think, has diminished the ability for green to be the predominant ramp color, right? What's diminished green's ability to be the predominant ramp color when we're talking about the vintage cube is things like Orcish Bowmasters. There are other cards and other reasons why that isn't just as strong, right, as it used to be back in the day, when having the access to green and being able to ramp quickly was pretty unique to green, unless you got very, very lucky in the draft and got yourself a Mox or got yourself a Soul Ring or got yourself a Mana Crypt. There's a lot of other ways to ramp yourself out, right? There's other artifacts that allow you to ramp quickly. There's Urza. There's treasures, right? So there's all these other ways that you can use to get yourself out there. I would consider the green mana dorks to be a strong archetype if you want to build a deck around them, but they kind of have, for at least for me, they've fell into that. When I'm building a green deck with those mana dorks, I'm looking to use those mana dorks to power out like 4-drop
or Crater Hoof. Crater Hoof is an ultimate.
Crater Hoof. I'm looking primarily for natural order if I'm Crater Hoofing out. But sure, if you've got enough ramp, not necessarily because you're tapping them, but sure, if you've got enough creatures and a guy's cradle, then yeah, you can get it out. But I'm looking more to cheat that out rather than I am to cast it. So I don't really think about that. But certainly for things like natural order. But even this kind of, again, is kind of indicative of where we're at with green, if that's what you want to talk about, which is fine.
Sure.
Green used to be, oh my gosh, I want to get my creatures out. I want to get my ramp out. I want a natural order. I want to get Crater Hoof, right? And try and swing for the win. Back in the day, would you have said that green's ability to ramp out and to get Crater Hoof out and swing was like the biggest reason to play natural order, maybe? And I'll ask you that. Like,
perhaps, yeah. Like literally, that was the win con.
But nowadays, I don't necessarily think so, right? If you gave me like, hey, would you rather have a Crater Hoof in your hand with no other information or an Atraxa? Then I'm probably going to pick an Atraxa as a card that I can natural order out, right? Like, sure, natural order into Crater Hoof is great. It's conditional, but it's very, very powerful. But that condition kind of makes it a lot weaker, in my opinion.
So overarching question, you wouldn't say that the prevalence of mana or the addition of all this
I don't think so.
Hasn't diminished those returns on green?
I think it's a different conversation.
It's a consensus for the audience because a lot of these, I guess these innate ideas are built into the idea of this fear that we're talking about. And I'm literally catchphrasing the word fear, so pardon that word. It's just meant to be clickbaity. But the idea is that I don't want to break my environment by introducing too much mana because it creates the prevalence. On the counterpoint, you introduced early on, as the player, you want to be able to play Magic. And that's an interesting scale to balance, right? The curator wants to maintain the thresholds of the environment. The player wants to play the environment. It's two different lenses to look through.
Yeah.
Right? You want to stay on curve.
Agreed.
You want to stay on track. You want to ramp out. You want to just play the game and have nice turnover, nice wins. You want to do what you're doing. You don't want to be inhibited by a bad mana base.
And that's like a decision that you're going to make as a curator.
I want to go back to the word bad mana base. There's no such thing as a bad mana base.
That is absolutely a thing as a bad mana base.
But that's a choice of the curator because they want to maintain the thresholds of their cube environment. That's where it gets so interesting on the counterpoints that we're going to talk about.
I don't disagree. But, I do disagree. I think there's definitely such a thing as a bad mana base. I think if you are really, really trying to force your players into an archetype, then I don't know if that's something that I would necessarily agree with, because I'm definitely someone who enjoys the creativity when it comes to every single draft of a cube. So I think the ability to be able to mix and match things is important. I think it's important for replayability. I think it's important for creativity. I think it's important for fun. So I would disagree. I think a good mana base, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have all the fetches, all the triumphs, but I think you need a good mana base.
So I think you bring a good point there. So I provide you the paint palette, the cube, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want me to provide you simply primary colors.
No.
You want to be able to mix your colors.
I do. I like purple.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, right? Like, that's a really good analogous idea of approaching this. But from the curator standpoint, they want to give you the primary colors. Rakdos does this, Orzhov does that. And I think what we can call the culprit to this idea, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in it, is Ravnica, the plane, where they really established the idea of guilds. And it became fixated. It became stuck, right? And we looked at it as that. Even our signpost, I've talked about this on numerous occasions. I do this all the time. In my gold section, in the previous, I would add only cards that serve the purpose of signposts that fit those guilds based on the archetypes, very Ravnica-esque in their thought process. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, and I think it does create that identity for those colors, right? Which in turn gives the players the ability to be able to identify with those colors and with those pairings, which then creates an emotional attachment to those pairings and to those guilds and to all that kind of stuff. So you can certainly see from a curator's perspective, if they have an emotional attachment to a cube in that way, that they're going to want players to be able to sit and draft the cube and to sort of lead them in that direction, right? Like, I want you to draft this guild and that guild and that guild, and this is kind of how I want to see it. That to me seems like it's a little bit more autonomous than I would like, right? I don't want drafts to run themselves, but I can certainly see as a framework that should work, right? To me, it should absolutely work. There should be a way to build a cube with a mana base, but with sort of that little gentle push for the players to be able to sort of, fulfill your vision, so to speak.
And then insert the human condition. The person who wants
creativity, that fun.
Yeah, now you want to take that and you're like, I don't want these primary colors.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make the color purple.
That's right.
And you don't want to be inhibited.
A great movie.
Yeah, it is, in fact. I haven't seen the remake, actually. I need to watch that one. I heard it's a musical. Yeah, I'm not a big musical person, but I'm willing to give it a try.
I love musicals, but I'll give it a try. Sure. So let's start looking at some actual cubes, right? Because everything we've talked about up until now has been a little hypothetical outside of the vintage cube. So let's talk about UberBear's horror cube. I would never just refer to it as your horror cube or the horror cube. It's always going to be UberBear's horror cube. And so your lands, right, your fixing in this cube is 52 out of 360 cards.
Correct, which is 14%.
That's a pretty healthy number.
That actually came from listening to a lot of podcasts, our good friends at LPR and ChillMTG and all these other curators out there in the world where we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but it was kind of before when I first built this cube, it was Innistrad proper. And then I expanded to, we're going to call it Innistrad Expanded, or the multiverse of where I'm running the Force of Wills. I'm running cards that you cannot just find in the plane of Innistrad. And because I chose to power creep outside of Innistrad, using the lands that were simply contained within Innistrad actually wasn't supporting the type of spells that I was promoting players to cast.
That's an interesting problem. Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you make, right? So you had a vision for the cube, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it that the lands just weren't providing the fixing that you wanted for the cube, or you just felt like the cube was...
It was chicken first, and we're going to call the chicken Innistrad.
Okay.
Yes. And whenever I just try to do that, it was zombies were Dimir, it was spirits were Azorius, it was vampires were Rakdos. Falling back on the sword of that Ravnica thought process, right, where the guilds had very preordained lines that I expected you to draft. And the emergence of those decks were happening quite regularly. And we talked about this, and we did a lot of play reps, and I saw it, and I kept seeing, well, you were one that talked about this. Spirits, Azoria Spirits were dominating games, and then the only thing that came in second place was Rakdos vampires, and then the werewolves were terrible. Everybody told me all about this, and I said enough is enough, to quote Pai.
I still talk about that. I've talked about it on episodes of this podcast, and I've talked about it when we've discussed this horror cube, but I will always remember that. We played your horror cube, UberBear's horror cube, and I drafted that spirits deck. I kind of figured the lane out fairly quickly, and it was unreal how open it was. And I'm thinking, Spirits, it was good. It was really good in Modern at that time, right? It was good in other formats, but I'm just going to keep drafting them and see how it goes. And I had this absolutely outrageous Azorius, and I don't even think I splashed. I think it was just straight Azorius, and it was running over players. It was just turn 5, which is crazy. Like, that is very, very fast to be winning consistently on turn 4/turn 5 in a thematic cube where there's no power, there's no combo necessarily to speak of. So that to me was a great example of, here's something that, sure, do you want players to be able to draft these Azoria Spirits decks? Absolutely. But that's a little bit overpowered in the grand scheme of the cube. And I don't necessarily think that this is a mana discussion, right? Because what would have happened then if you'd have said, okay, well, I'm going to introduce some fixing, and I've got, greater fixing, whatever, and I've got abilities in those other colors to even power up that Azoria Spirits deck. So then what do you do? Do you reduce the ability for other archetypes to be able to power up the Spirits deck? Do you then just go back and say, okay, well, now I can't include the fixing to power up that Spirits deck? Or do I reduce the power of the Spirits? And now this is a bit of a quandary that you're coming in, because now you're like, wow, I had this vision for like these wedges and these archetypes in these cubes, and now it's like I've introduced this fixing, right? And potentially maybe even other cards that would provide support for this archetype, and maybe not even just for that archetype, maybe for other archetypes as well. How do you get past the quandary like that? How do you design the cube and sort of contain that within the whole scope of it?
So in my first iteration of this, I had the AB duels, had the shocks, I had the fetches. So I did break outside of that scheme as far as that's concerned. That's always been there. Mm-hmm. And I even had like Wasteland and all these things. I had a lot of stuff. I was playing very powered vintage cube equals Innistrad. It was very weird. But the epiphany came to me, the cog that I pulled. We talked about this a lot of times before. Picture the steampunk man pulling all the levers, steam blowing everywhere, doesn't know what they're changing, doesn't know what's happening. You got to have a control for the experiment. Stop, step back, breathe. What am I going to change when I'm looking at the ceiling as my spirits, Azorius, and the floor as my werewolves, Gruul? What am I going to do to make it different? I'm not going to bolster or add too much of that. In hindsight, I did add a little bit more Gruul wolves, but it doesn't matter. It didn't change the dynamic. What I did change is the mana base. I increased pathways and I added pain lands, which was difficult for me to find art that fit that gothic horror theme. And that's kind of the point we're driving home here. It was hard for me to break outside of those lanes because originally I was running the lands that were very much either printed in Innistrad expanded sets, right? Stuff like that, Midnight Hunt, etc. And or I was just kind of doing a few minor Vintage Cube stuff expectations. But the minute I added that additional suite of lands and increased that up, and I think it was around 9% at the time of actual lands to the current 14, is when I actually started seeing equilibrium in the decks. It wasn't splashing. It wasn't good stuff. It's the 2-color decks started breaking loose and started becoming 3-color decks, which created diversity in the deck building. And the very first example that I saw in this was a funny and a very poor example. We were at SEG Con, I believe it was Richmond. And an individual had drafted and won with a Rug Werewolves deck. To date, Werewolves had just been getting just slaughtered. Like, nobody wanted to play Werewolves. It was like a running joke in our play group. Like, why are you even running Werewolves?
Werewolves have always had a bit of a struggle going on as far as power is concerned.
They have.
They struggled early on.
And there's a little bit of variance to this conversation. You know, Day Night came out, so it made them a little better. They made a little bit better Werewolves. So I can't remove all these variables from the equation. But the thing that I was trying to control was when I added the additional lands is people were able to splash. And I started breaking out of that Ravnica mindset of werewolves must be Gruul. Hence, we got a Rug Werewolf. And it was such a weird one. It was, dude, I just won with Rug Werewolves. He basically ran counter magic and werewolves. So they weren't so vulnerable to all that black removal that was so prevalent in the cube. Or it wasn't getting destroyed by the blue player, bouncing all this hard work you had done, etc. They even splashed, air quotes, we talked about this splash, cryptic command.
That's incredibly impressive. Now, that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of fixing you've got to have.
It got better.
To splash a triple blue card in a predominantly green-red deck. Like, that's incredibly impressive.
And it was just pressing those lands and moving that needle up on that land count was the biggest factor for changing how this is played. And I've observed since we've played that cube, it was played at CubeCon 2023. And the deck that took the actual entire set and the individual that won with that moved up to the top 8, if I'm not mistaken. They won with the Spells Matters package, running 3, splashing 4 colors, and they appreciated the mana base.
Yep.
Whereas before, you could have never done that in this cube. It was very, vampires are Rakdos. Humans are Selesnya. This is what you did. It was very much, whether I wanted it to be that way or not, it ran on rails. And it's interesting. So just by adding a few percentages up my land, probably 5-6%, by adding 2 more suites, it made a significant difference in the playstyles of the cube. It blew my mind.
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Like, you've got to, not to necessarily lean hard on the good cop, bad cop kind of routine, but this is where I think that a closed-minded approach to, I don't want that to be viable, or I don't want players to do that in my cube, stifling the ability for your players to be able to show you the potential that's out there in your cube. I'm not quite sure why you would want that rather than, you can always go back. You can always say, right, I'm going to add them for like a few weeks, a few drafts, whatever the case may be. Let's give the players the ability with some really, really good fixing to just see what's out there, to see what's possible with this cube. If you've got good drafters in your group or at your store or whatever, then you're going to be able to get some pretty good data on what's possible with your cube, right? So maybe that's something that for the people out there, for the curators out there that are kind of edging towards that, no, I really don't want that there because I want to stick with the themes that I've designed for the cube. Maybe just try that, right? Throw some fixing, throw some triomes, throw some whatever, throw some mirage fetches in there if it makes you, if it makes you feel better, and just see what your players come up with.
It opened up strange lanes, which I kind of want to move over to what this is the focus of the episode. And this is from our good friend Poison Donut. I'm not going to not reveal their actual name, but it recently in an LGS, the gathering place, I went and hung out one Wednesday night. And when I sat down at the table, I was really excited. I drove about an hour away because they're going to have an Innistrad cube. And I am like hyped to play me an Innistrad cube by comparison to the Horror Cube, because that's just my game, right?
Yes,
and I was so happy to go out there and do it. So Poison Donut has designed this absolutely gorgeous Innistrad Singleton set-esque type of cube, right?
Spooky
cube. Yeah, spooky Innistrad, which will be in the show notes. And you guys got to check this out. Absolutely love this cube. But when I sat down at the table, the first conversation that I heard, and I asked permission to discuss this, was the deliberation amongst the regulars, the play group at the table. I'm the outsider looking in, and they're discussing the mana fixing and how, and correct me if I'm wrong there, Poison, but it was along the lines of, I recently added shocks because the play group was really kind of pressing for me to add more fixing. And the apprehension, I sense the apprehension as the person from the outside looking in. I'm listening. And that Poison Donut wanted to refrain from the idea, and they were very clear, and they said, yeah, that sounds good. They were very clear, and they said, my personal opinion is I want the lands to fit the theme, not cater to 4 to 5 color ideas. So challenge accepted. When I sat down at this table, I knew what I was going to draft kind of. So I drafted an Esper control deck, specifically breaking out of it. So I went into the Orzhov type of vampires, a little bit of Spirit Splash, and kind of leaned into the good stuff very intentionally because recently, according to the playgroup and the table talk, Shocklands had been introduced to this. Prior to that, it had always been the Innistrad, the lands that were received during the actual set. And just watching the emergence and the discussion that happened, I didn't win. I didn't 3-0 that draft, but I had a very powerful deck. And I went through and I think I 2-0'd basically. I won 2 matches. I was doing really well. And I wanted to reinsure Poison that it was a really good addition. And there wasn't I guess back to the Fear 5, and I'm using that in a very loosey-goosey kind of way, that it wasn't hurting the environment by having additional fixing. It let me diverge outside of those lanes and not just play Orzhov human/vampire. It didn't let me just play spirit/vampire. It let me make this amalgamation and pull them together. But it wasn't just like a splash. It was a very strong, comfortable, synergistic deck that broke out of that from the additions of the Shocklands. So I can understand. And a person that has a Horror Cube, I understand that 100%. The Innistrad base, you don't want to break the theme. You know what you want your cube to do. You know how you want it to perform. But it's really interesting to see how players will take that and run with it.
Well, you want it to be on theme, right? Is just let's talk about this from a theme and restriction perspective. The restriction is the theme, right? The restriction is the theme is Innistrad. The restriction is I want cards that were printed in the Innistrad block, right? Or in those sets, or, you know, adjacent sets or whatever the case may be, right? That's your limitation. The creativity comes from your players being able to combine all those ideas, right? Innistrad was a super cool set, right? A lot of big fans out there. A lot of people, if you go out there right now on the socials and say, hey, what was your favorite Magic set? I bet a non-zero number, in fact, probably a decent number of people are going to say, oh, I loved Innistrad. Is it going to be because of the cards that were in there? The card types, what was introduced during Innistrad? Maybe, but a lot of people really liked Innistrad because of just the vibe, right? It had such a cool vibe, did Innistrad, right? So now you're giving your players the ability to expand on and just be so creative with your, you know, maybe it wasn't your favorite set, right? So to Poison Donut, you know, I'm not sure if this was your favorite set or if this was just a set that you decided that you wanted to build this cube around. But either way, now you've gifted your play group, people in your store, whoever's going to draft your cube, you've gifted them this ability to not only draft this cube that you know, enjoy the theme, if that's what it was, but now be so creative about, you know, all the possibilities that are out there within that cube. And that is not, it's restricted if you don't include enough mana for that. That's my opinion of it, right? You can tell me that I'm wrong, but my opinion is that if you restrict the color fixing, you're pigeonholing people into having to draft fairly specific decks. And I think the more that you restrict the color fixing, the more that it's like, okay, I kind of have to draft 2 color decks because the 3 color fixing just isn't there. Maybe it's there a little bit, but the deck's not going to be very good. You know, and ultimately, if you've got a 2 color deck, right, that third color, if my mana fixing isn't very good, that third color that I'm splashing for with the crappy fixing better be godlike. It better really, really be worthwhile me making a poor mana base, right? What am I going to do? Add a couple of basic forests in my Dimir deck for some random card? Like, I don't want to do that.
Uvenwald.
Ulvenwald Oddity is not going to make me splash 2 forests in any deck. I don't care how aggressive or how green I'm trying to be, right? So, like I said, I think you give that opportunity to your players. Nothing bad can come of it.
So I'm the good cop in this story. So
I'm the bad cop.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
So I understand the apprehension of not wanting to break the lanes, right? So Innistrad was a very well-crafted set. So I get this idea too. It is absolutely incredible. And I'm going to go so far as to say this cube is incredible. It's actually post in the future, a week behind us, been featured at the UberCube event. Yeah, so I actually put it in there because I fell in love with this cube and I loved everything about what the curator had to say. And then since I can see the addition of Surveil lands, I can see the addition of Shock lands and opening up. But one of the recommendations that I made to Poison Donut was, I don't want to nudge you too far. I understand the apprehension. You don't want to break the lanes, but I think Talisman would really just crank this open and create more options. And that was my other suggestion about this cube. Otherwise, this cube is just gorgeous. They're not the same. If I'm putting them on the same lane as my Uber Bears Horror Cube versus the Spooky Cube that we have here, they're different. One leans more definitely into the lore of Innistrad. Mine leans more into its gothic horror. They're different, but the same.
Absolutely.
But I'm not encouraging the complete breaking the mold of that. I'm just saying a little bit more mana boost. 3-color decks, I feel, are very safe, in my opinion. I understand the apprehension of 4 and 5 color. That I'd actually want to stymie too, because then the themes can get disjointed through the representation of the drafts, right? You want the players to see that the vampires matter. You want the players to see the humans matter. I understand the fact that you want those typal factions to matter. Makes a lot of sense to me from that, because you want to protect those lanes. But simultaneously, again, going back to the primary color argument that I said, it's really great when you give a palette, but painters want to paint with what colors they're provided. They don't want to even just do purple. They want to do a shade of purple. And that's just what they want from their artistic standpoint as well. So it's always this direct kind of this balancing thing. You're trying as a curator, trying to represent this idea simultaneously. You've got your players that have an expectation and you're having to find that balance. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. So I think maybe not necessarily as succinctly as you usually do, but this is a point that I think kind of goes over that in a similar manner. The juice has to be worth the squeeze when it comes to the mana base, right? I need a good reason to be able to include those lands in my deck. I need a good reason to be able to splash. As a curator, when you look at the scope of your cube, right, and you're looking at all of these archetypes and you're looking at the wedges, the guilds, whatever you want to call it, when you're looking at the cube and you're looking at, okay, I don't want to add all this fixing because I don't want players to be able to draft these 3, 4, 5 color good stuff decks, right? I want players to be able to stick within the archetypes that I've designed. This is how the vision is for the cube that I've put together. Ask yourself this. If you were to sit down and draft all of these archetypes that you have designed for this cube, can you honestly look at that and say, actually, if I had the fixing, this would make that deck better with a bit of fixing, and it supports this archetype that I've put together and adds some challenge and some dynamism to the drafting process. For me, I love that about cubes, where I look at a card and I think, I would love that card for my deck right now. But is someone drafting that? Is it possible that I might get that card back? And not only do I kind of want that card, the fixing that I need for it is also in the same pack. It's kind of the worst. Isn't that one of the worst?
It's the worst.
In the world, when you're like, I want that card, but the fixing is also in the same pack.
You got to eat your veggies,
and
man.
if I take the card, the fixing's gone. And if I take the fixing, the card's gone. But this is, I kind of feel like we always talk about the 40,000 foot view of your cube. Take a look at that and take a look at those wedges, right? And sort of imagine all those guilds or those archetypes, whatever. And imagine you're flying all that height over your cube, and all of those wedges, those archetypes, those guilds, whatever, are all kind of spaced out. And then imagine, if you will, from your helicopter or your Blackbird or your, private jet, if
SR-71,
SR-71, exactly. You've got your binoculars out and you're kind of looking, and you've got all these lines that are drawn out from all of the cards or from the archetypes to all the cards that could potentially be not powerhouses, but nice support cards for all of that. For me, I would love, this is kind of my, I've been dragging this cube along for about 6 years now, and I'm hoping to get there eventually. But in my ideal world, when this Doom Cube gets finished, is that I can look down at my 180 to be 360 card cube, and I see all these lines coming out from the different archetypes. And there's kind of a equidistant number of little, supportive cards that are out there that can exist independently or can exist in these other archetypes that are also out there. Creates a bit of competition, which I also think
that's actually a shout out to LPR of their emergent cube design, where they pick a card and then they find waypoints and they keep moving. That's kind of what you're doing there.
And I've got, and this is something I'm going to reference this. I don't think it's going to be our next episode, but I'm going to reference this in an episode coming up. It's going to be a sort of design philosophy episode, and it's going to follow on from how I've looked at this Doom Cube, but I think it will kind of reiterate this point, precisely. So you've got all these lines out there, right? How do you make those lines, or how do you sort of judge those lines? And how do you judge, how many of these lines do I want? How many of these support cards do I want? Do I want none of them? I kind of feel like that would be a little bit too restrictive. Do I want every single card to be able to support every archetype? Obviously not. But you want some non-zero number of these sort of competition cards, if you will, that could be good in some, great in some, maybe not so great in others, but they're challenging the players to be able to choose. Do I take that? Again, it sucks to have to make the decision between the card or the fixing, but sometimes that adds that little bit of dynamism that can make the draft interesting. And it all comes back to that sort of confluence of the cube design and the mana support as well, because one has to exist for the other one to even be relevant, right? And one is irrelevant if the other doesn't exist. So, and I suppose I'll ask you that with the cubes that you have right now, is that a view that you look at your cubes where you're looking at these support cards that can exist around, that don't even have to be archetype specific, but that are out there, and how this can all sort of fit in, not just with the overall global view of the cube, but also with the fixing that you're providing as well?
I would lean in towards regarding the horror cube, it's my most insular cube. It's the one that's very typal, right? It's very typal driven.
It is very typal.
And as a
result, it's an Innistrad cube.
And as a result, that creates this tension that I understand Poison Donut is feeling, right? That you don't want to break out and have this emergence of 3 to 4 color good stuff. That's that fear of 5 that we're kind of talking about. That makes more sense to me. I'm okay with dying on that hill, and I can support the idea of dying that hill. But my other cubes, like the Fem cube, where I do have archetypes, but they're very heavily color supported, that I'm willing to break outside of that spectrum. We'll talk about that in a second. Or my artifact cube, which has a predominance of colorless artifacts in the cube, which also supports the idea of me being loosey-goosey my lands. We'll talk about that in a second. Or my Powered Vintage cube, where the expectation from the players is I can do what I want. I get the entire color palette. Don't give me primary colors in my Powered Vintage cube. Give me the ability to make whatever color palette I want. Splash, give me Flame Slash, give me Preordain, give me Demonic Tutor, right? Let me do what I want when I want.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting. But the cubes have these kind of preordained ideas behind them. Generic cubes versus thematic cubes are very challenging with their mana support and what you choose to put in there.
Bad Cop Hat coming on.
Yep.
If you're so concerned about your good stuff decks being too good, why do your archetypes not provide enough power? And is that a concern? Is that even a factor in the cube design? Because surely, right, for me, I agree, and I get the idea of I don't just want, because then, I've talked about the whole, drafts becoming autonomous thing, right? You don't want the drafts to become such that players are just drafting the best card and not thinking about it.
And you don't want to be like this generic amalgamation of nonsense either. So I get that too, where it just kind of kills the idea of the typal idea.
Of the type, exactly.
Just a generic splash of a vampire and a zombie. From a thematic standpoint, from the curator's hat, putting it on, we're thinking about the plane. We're thinking about the world building. We're thinking about the construction of the game design. The player's thinking about the evaluation of the efficiency. They're thinking about whether or not this is going to go on curve, whether or not it's going to win the game for me. These are two different perspectives that are completely in juxtaposition of one another when you're trying to put it on rails with mana base.
And let me go back to that Spirits deck. Do you know the reason why what shocked me the most about that Spirits deck. It wasn't that it just absolutely telestomped the entire table every single time. I dropped one game, and it was because I literally drew just land after land after land. I think I played 4 games and I went 8-1. What surprised me the most about drafting that deck was the spirits are super strong. And obviously there's a ton of synergy with them, right? A lot of that synergy though, I've got some lords in there and I've got some when a spirit enters and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of really, really good spirits that are just independently powerful by themselves. And some of those really strong spirits that I was getting, I'm thinking, I don't necessarily have to be drafting 1-2 of this color. Like, this could be a splash to try and make this card work in my deck. And I was surprised that some of the cards that I got really late in the draft weren't taken earlier. Like, I'm thinking this is a really, really powerful independent card. Like, you don't need a spirits deck for this card to be good. This card is just good by itself. Why is this card not being taken? Was that because the players themselves felt like they were so pigeonholed into having to draft anything that was good for their archetype that they were kind of scared that, oh man, maybe I run out of cards that are going to be good, or maybe I run out of, power, or my curve isn't very good, or whatever the case may be. That, to me, seems like, and I almost feel like I'm arguing against myself a little bit there, because you don't, do you want players to be taking the cards that are kind of the glue for an archetype? Maybe, maybe not. But then again, if those cards are the glue for the archetype and it's only a couple of them because they're independently good, then maybe the archetype isn't that good in the first place.
So my pointed question for you, back to the Fear 5, is are the lands and the diversity of lands the enabler to allow you to break outside of those primary colors? Yes or no? Okay.
Yes.
All right. We're going to move over to our next cube.
So let's talk about our next cube, UberBears, the Fem cube. Bounce lands.
Mm-hmm.
I am a huge fan of the bounce lands. They're not shocks. They're not Aberdools. They're not fetches. But they are a legitimately very, very strong option in a cube where, let's be honest, you can kind of afford to take a turn off, right? Yes, there's a cost associated with them. It's one land that you basically don't get access to because it's not bounce and untap land. It's just bounce a land. So sure, you can play a land and tap it and cast a spell. And then next turn, you just play the bounce land and bring that back, tap land or whatever after you've used it back to your hand. So there is an associated cost with it, but that cost is really, really offset, in my opinion, by the fact that now you've got a land that taps for 2. In that cube, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's any strip mine or wasteland.
There are
or
not.
Ghost Quarter
I cut
effects.
them all.
So you get the bounce land. If it's in play, it's in play.
I
It's
let
there
it happen.
forever.
Yeah.
That's very, very powerful. Talk to me about how that's impacted the speed of the deck as well as the archetype availability for people looking to draft those 3, 4, 5 color decks.
So this is another one of those cases where I wanted to increase the density of lands in the cube, right? We know from previous playtesting, we talked about this before, that Boros was the dominant factor. With the Emma Partlow episode, we kind of talked about the lean in on the fact that white cards had the most predominance, the Thalias of the world. They were the very aggressive decks, all that.
Let's not, I want to give honorable mention to the Golgari because
Yes.
Emma and I did a bunch of drafts of your cube beforehand and we seemed to do a bunch of parallel styled like Golgari, Liliana, good stuff kind of deck.
And in preparation for CubeCon 2024, which I have submitted this cube, I decided to increase the land density.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided to do a choice that wasn't cost prohibitive because I didn't want to spend any more money because I am the purveyor of 8 cubes. It's way too many cubes. And I can't afford to keep up with the Joneses all the time. And I had a plethora of bounce lands, and I've heard nothing but good thing about bounce lands. But they also supported the idea of like control decks, kind of long game decks going into the mid-range, long-term decks. And I had kind of tilted the scales where aggression in the cube was kind of not as strong, and I wanted to support the idea of mid-range. So by adding bounce lands, again, putting on the blinders, the assumption is that I'm going to allow, those long-term control decks, those mid-range decks to emerge. The stuff that really wants to take the time off, as you mentioned, to bounce that land back, to get that additional mana source to push them forward. So that was a choice I made to press that forward to get more mid-range, more control out of that cube. So that is the cog that I pulled. Instead of changing all of the cube dynamics, I just cut a couple of cards and added that suite, giving more land density, opening up the lanes, not to make this like gross amalgamation or this generic soup of cards, but rather to allow players to express themselves and go outside of what the vision that I simply have, because I have a limited vision. I'm the curator. I know what I want to see. I want to see Izzet does Spells Matters. I want to see Orzhov does Aristocrats. I want to see that, right? But that's not necessarily what the players want to see. The players want to be able to paint with that full palette, not the primary colors. So this was my expansion piece. So I pulled that cog. I'm going to test it. The next one, though, this is an interesting one.
You've mentioned this on a few occasions as being, in your opinion, and I would say even maybe including the vintage cube in this, is that the artifact cube is maybe your most complex to both draft and play of all the cubes that you own. I'll ask
Agreed.
you if you still believe that that is the case. And I would say that I agree with that. You
cannot enjoy beer and play the artifact cube.
You cannot, which I did. I generally tend to, and that's not a good idea. Like, you really need to be like hyper-focused in order to get the most out of this. But there's so much going on with the artifact cube. There's so many synergies. There's so many things that are, impacting everything. What's in your hand, what's on your board, what's on your opponent's board, your opponent's hand, so on and so forth. So I said, maybe you should just add the shocks to this. Very, very straightforward. And it's cheap, right? Maybe not for everybody, but in the grand scheme of things, at least compared to fetch lands and compared to the Abradul lands, especially, adding shocks, the suite of 10, is a relatively cheap way to just bang 10 lots of fixing into your cube and be done with it, right? You didn't like it. You said, but I'm running the pain lands.
I am.
And I'm running the artifact lands. And the artifact lands make so much sense, right? They're on theme. What did this do to that cube?
Yeah.
I want to know let's first of all talk about why you felt that you needed to expand the fixing.
So, cube card number 1, my fixing was light, and it was definitely noticed by the players because it's approximately 30% colorless. So the assumption is that the mana fixing didn't have to be prevalent because a predominant or a large portion of the cube is in fact colorless. And going back to your Shockland idea, because I'm running Pain Lands, I didn't want everybody to have to pay for the colors. I have thought about this. I'm pondering it. Post the event, which is in the future, but will be in the past whenever we talk about this, I probably will consider adding the suite of 10 Shocklands. I don't want fetches in here because it'll disjoint. It maybe speed up some things. It kind of goes back to that steampunk idea of pulling those levers. I'm pulling too many levers. I want to keep a control to the experiment. I'm willing to do this in small batches. I'm not opposed to the idea of adding Shocklands to this cube, but right now, the mana base has never had a complaint. Players have been able to successfully pull off whatever they want when asked, right? Like, splashes have happened. I've seen 3-4 color good stuff, but it's mostly leans into the 2-3 colors is kind of what it does just naturally.
I was going to mention that. Like, I've drafted this cube a bunch of times, and I will say that I've had the most success when kind of limiting myself to the 2 colors. And it never felt like I was limiting myself because the fixing wasn't quite there for me to expand out into either a 3 or a 4 color deck. I always felt like I just did a better job of drafting a deck when I limited myself just because that's what the archetype or the deck I was trying to draft just did better with only a couple of colors, right? And I'm always cognizant of the fact that if you're putting another color in there, it has to be worthwhile.
Impactful,
It has to be, and not just a little bit. If your fixing isn't there, it better be a bomb, like a mega bomb, like a neutron hydrogen bomb, if I'm putting something like that in a deck like that where the fixing isn't very good. So you've said that there's no fetches in there.
Correct.
Right? So no fetches means that I do not have the ability to just go and get the shock, right? To go and get that. So that by itself is a huge restriction. In fact, I would almost argue that even if you'd have added Abraduls over the shocks, it really wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference because you can't fetch for them, right? How has this impacted the availability for your players to be able to expand out in a meaningful way, knowing that those players only have so much fixing available to them, and the fact that they don't have the ability to go and fetch for them.
I want to lean back into the 30% of this landscape is colorless. It hasn't been restrictive. I've been able to be more loose with my lands opposed to traditional cubes. There's no expectation of that mana base because most of the stuff you can cast with any old thing, right? So it hasn't been like prohibitive in the expansion of this cube. I haven't felt the need to push that mana base any further. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's where I'm at right now, right? Until it gets to the point where modern Magic, if anything pushes forward, I understand that. But the current state, I'm okay with not breaking outside that, adding shocks and fetches. No one's ever asked for it. No one's ever needed it at this point. And they're painting with colors that are all over the place. It's that palette doesn't seem so restrictive. It's not primary. Does that make sense?
It does. The artifact lands I can understand, right? They're on theme. The pain lands, I vibe with the pain lands in this cube. And the reason why I do is because it's a painful cube. Let's be honest. It's painful.
Yeah, it's technical.
It's very technical. It's painful. It's tough. It's glorious.
I think adding more lands would disrupt that equilibrium. That's my opinion. Like, I don't want to, it would just unsettle the environment, quicken some things that I don't want to be quickened. It's different. I'm not leaning in on the color, I guess, the color spectrum that I would be leaning on traditionally, right?
So I would ask this. So you mentioned that the majority of this cube, or a large enough portion of this cube, is colorless, right?
Yes.
So what kind of percentage are we talking about in the early game compared to the late game? I'm putting you on the spot.
I've got a bunch of zeros, ones, and twos, if that's what you're asking.
A lot of zeros, a lot of ones, a lot of twos.
Like,
so
you can literally enter
players.
the battle. You can early game for either 0, 1, or 2 for colorless. So you're not held back. You can ginger brood out super fast. You don't even have to worry about the color restriction. Yeah. It's a whole different landscape than evaluating it versus like the Innistrad cube, where we've got these lanes that are very defined.
Yeah, you need that colored mana immediately
to support the idea of the archetypes. Yeah. Very Ravnica build, whereas this one, it's not generic good stuff, it's technical good stuff, but if you want to reach outside of those veins, it gets more complex.
Well, it could be. Here's the thing. How much of that generic good stuff is colorless?
Quite a bit. I mean, there's a fair amount. So I mean, we got like meteor golems and whatnot. We're digging in a little bit.
So now you're not restricting.
I'm not holding any. I'm not holding this cube doesn't. It's never once felt
the good stuff aren't being held.
It's never been held. It's always this one's always felt natural by having this mana base opposed to, say, my Power Vintage Cube. If I took the same mana base and displaced it and put it inside of my Power Vintage Cube, it would feel very restrictive.
It would be atrocious.
It would be atrocious.
It'd be unplayable.
It'd be dry. Yeah. And players couldn't paint with the colors they wanted. That's what's interesting about the dynamic of lands. So the lands can be curated to fit the environment. The only good cop, bad cop we have is regarding the Innistrad expansion, because Typal does create a whole dynamic going back to that Ravnican roots, right? That's kind of what kind of created all this. Sure. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So,
but
Poison Donut has made an absolutely gorgeous cube. I love the cube for what it is.
There you go. Exactly.
I mean, it is what it. In those preordained notions that my mana base won't be perfect, I knew that going in as the drafter. The expectation was made very clear, and I knew that I had to prioritize the lands to get the good Esper deck that I built. So that's an interesting dynamic that also gets inserted.
And that's a drafter that you are, right? Let's be honest. We could even talk about, this is after our event, right? Which at this point when this is
Before, after,
right? Before recording, after releasing. But we had the pleasure of drafting. There was a person there that brought a cube that wanted us to play. And Anthony was like, I'm just going to take all the lands, right? It was a 6-player draft of an unpowered vintage cube. Right? And you were like, I'm just going to take a ton of these lands, right? Fixing is never a bad thing to take if it's remotely in line with what I'm trying to play. I got nothing in the form of fixing, which really, really kind of sucked.
My deck fired.
Your deck was pretty good, yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't feel bad about assembling the Urza Thopter sort of factory, by the way.
Kind of had to.
I had to. It was there, so I've got to do it. But that was a cube that was slowed down significantly by the fact that there's no power, no Lotus, or no Mox and no Black Lotus. I don't know if there was a Sol Ring or a Mana Crypt.
It was literally inhibited intentionally.
It was very, very inhibited. And I kind of want to sort of close off before we get to the final thoughts that I really want to separate this conversation from the acceleration, because you talked about the signets.
Yeah.
And you talked about the talismans.
Yeah.
I think there is a distinct discussion there. And maybe this is something for a future episode where you really got to sort of play a fine line between what can be considered acceleration. I actually do think that there's a conversation about how the fixing by itself is acceleration, because you have the ability to just play more spells in your hand potentially if you're drafting one of those.
Yeah, you splash green, you can do a rampant growth or a Kadama's reach, for example.
Or right? Even just
it gives you outside reach.
It does, or even I've drafted a 3 or 4 color deck and I've got really, really amazing fixing, and now I don't have to worry about my ability to be able to cast my spells. And that is a huge weight off my shoulders when I'm drafting something, right? Is if I open up my my pack, or my opening 7, and I've got 2 fetch lands there, or a shock and a fetch, or even a basic and a fetch, and I know that I've got the shock land right there that can fix those last 2 colors. Those other 5 cards that are in my hand, I know I can cast them. So it's almost like playing on curve can be almost a bit of acceleration if you have a mana base that can support a 3 or 4 color deck, rather than thinking, man, really hope I draw that mountain in the next couple of turns.
Let's move over to our final thoughts. So the lands that we've discussed, there's a pro and con to this idea, right? I understand as a curator standpoint.
There's a pro, yeah.
There's a pro for the player. There's a con for the curator, because it can kind of make their thematic design a little bit more generic than they want it to be.
Well, who are you making this cube for? Are you making it for you, or are you making it for me?
That is the core question.
You're making it for me.
You're making it for your players.
You're making it for me.
You're presenting. But I also get the idea when Poison Donut has the apprehension and an absolutely gorgeous cube that 4 to 5 color good stuff is something that this person doesn't want to, display, right? That makes sense to me.
Ask yourself why you don't want it. Ask yourself if the archetypes are weak, so that your 5 color, 4 color, 3 color good stuff is too strong, and that sort of takes that agency away from the players. If your archetypes are strong enough, think about all the fixing that's in a vintage cube. Are you going to tell me that the ability for all the players to draft a good stuff deck means that Reanimate isn't a strong, or isn't one of the most powerful decks, or the Wheels deck, or the Underworld Breach Brain Freeze decks? Those decks are very, very powerful. That might be an outlier power-wise, but all of that fixing hasn't taken away from the fact that those archetypes are very powerful. You can scale that down to your thematic cube, to your Innistrad cube, to whatever. Right? If your archetypes are there, if the strength of the archetypes are inherently just good enough that those good stuff decks can almost be, and this is something else I've mentioned in the past, maybe the good stuff decks need to be there for the drafters that kind of get screwed out of drafting their archetype because someone took that one card that they needed in the first pack and then didn't draft it because they got another archetype in their second and third and fourth pack. And it was like, oh, I don't need that enabler for this really, really strong archetype that's in there. And also maybe sometimes it's just, I want to turn creatures sideways.
I'm going to go with, it's your cube, going back to the Fear 5, but you have to, I implore you to listen to your players, because you're presenting to your players. And other than that, we're going to move over to our socials.
All right, so first of all, as always, I want to give a huge shout out to our Patreons, to Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nicola Point, Stephen Conafile, Preston, and Sam McKenna. Huge thanks to all of you guys for the ongoing support. If you want to come chat about Cube, you can check out our MTG. I say our. It's
not technically ours.
Not ours.
It's really not.
An MTG Facebook drafting page at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube. Go check it out. Our very own Anthony Adams is an admin over there, and he'll be happy to chat with you and, well, ban you if you don't say something that he likes. As always, if you enjoy the show, this episode or any of the other episodes, we would really appreciate, give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. If you want to use our altersleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link, you can go there and get 5% off your purchase. You can also use our Inked Gaming affiliate link, inkgaming.com/UberCube. Get some really cool bling for your cube. Playmats, dice bags, mouse pads.
Support your artist.
Support your artist, absolutely. You can find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod, or if you've got a longer question or comment about the show or, whatever about Cube, reach out to us, UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. You know where the Discord is at this point. Come show us your decks. Come talk to us about your cube or someone else's cube or your wife's boyfriend's cube or whatever the case may be. We want to hear about it. We're happy to talk about it. And let's keep the conversation going about the cubism.
Other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube. Don't fear the 5. Happy cubing!